All right, good afternoon to each of you. Today, I hope to finish up probably one of the hardest lessons in the whole series, which is the first part of chapter 20. And there's two reasons why it's hard. One, there is symbols used here that are not used elsewhere in Scripture. So that doesn't give us a lot of precedent to go on to try to decode it and figure out what they mean. So we have to focus on adapting the other symbols that are the most similar to it. And even some of those symbols that it's based off of, they're only used once. So that makes it even harder. The other thing that makes this really hard is this is the playground where all of premillennialism comes from. And so there are several different groups that spend a lot of their energy and a lot of their time promoting premillennialism. And closely associated with that is the physical reconstruction and the investment in Palestine, in Israel. They're trying to rebuild ancient Israel. And a lot of the politicians of the United States that you see that talk about Israel and are very focused, part of it's pragmatic, trying to have an ally in a very difficult region, but part of it is their constituents who believe firmly that Israel must be rebuilt, and there must be a king there again, must be on the throne. The temple's going to be rebuilt. They're going to restore worship, everything. It's going to be just like it was. So that is actually in the agenda of a lot of people, and they get that from this chapter, from just a few verses. So it's a dense set of verses, very much misunderstood, so there's a lot to unpack there. And as I said at the beginning of class, unfortunately, I didn't upload my slides. So we're going to be looking at a very old version of my slides that I haven't looked at in a long time. So it's going to be as much a surprise to you as it is to me as we go through the class. So the reason why I say that is, please make sure that you kind of look at the slides that I do eventually end up giving to you. There's going to be a lot more information, a lot more verses that I'm not going to be able to remember because brain's not what it used to be, obviously. So let's get into the millennium. So we talked about this very briefly last time, so I'm not going to spend much time, but I want to get it before you. The first 3 verses of chapter 20. Just read this, make a comment here, where John says, I saw the angel. Remember, this is right after the battle of Armageddon. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, having the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. He laid hold of the dragon, that serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan. So no misunderstanding. We have 4 names applied to the same being here. And bound him for 1,000 years. And he cast him into the bottomless pit and shut him up and set a seal on him, so that he should deceive the nations no more till the 1,000 years were finished. But after these things he must be released for a little while. So obviously this is supposed to be interpreted figuratively. How is he restrained? This is what we talked about last time. The key is what's in this verse. He's bound, shut up, seal on him, so that what? So that he would deceive the nations no more. This doesn't mean that the devil can't have any influence, that he can't have any effect. You don't have to go too far into our world to see that the devil's influence is still there. But he doesn't have the same level of control and influence that he did during the days of the Roman Empire, where he essentially had all of Western civilization under his thumb, both the government and then the religion to support it. So not that global level of control. So several people have used the analogy of like a dog on a lead on a runner that's on a chain. He can go back and forth. He can still wander. He can still get anything that comes into his territory. So if we wander into his territory, then he is glad to devour us and to influence those who come into his territory with his thinking. And he will certainly be able to have control in a more limited scale over governments and over people, but just not to the global scale before. So very quickly, we talked about this last time. There is a generic way in which Jesus reduced the devil's power through his ministry, through the cross, through the gospel. But that's not what this is talking about. Again, it's specifically talking about this global scale, this reduced deceptive influence. Remember all the verses that we saw that talked about the kings of the whole earth and the whole world that were brought under the harlot's influence and the sea beast influence. So it's that level that's been reduced. All right, so one of the things I wanted to change about the way I also made like changes to 3 or 4 of the questions. So there's an awful lot to unpack kind of all at once. So what I want to do is, instead of trying to figure out exactly what the millennium is at the beginning of this as we go through the study, what I want us to do is try to make sure that we identify all the facts and attributes that are associated with that. And then we can kind of take a step back and say, okay, putting all these pieces together, what are we talking about here? What is this millennium that we're talking about? So that's what I originally tried to do. We'll see how that actually works out. All right, so verses 4 and 6 here, John says, and I saw thrones. So this is right after the devil's thrown into the bottomless pit and shut up for 1,000 years. And we're told that he will come out again for a little while. All right, he says, I saw thrones, and they sat on them. Who is they? And judgment was committed to them. Again, who is they? Then I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for their witness to Jesus and for the word of God, who had not worshipped the beast or his image, and had not received his mark on their forehead or on their hands. And they lived and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. But they shall be priests of God and of Christ, and shall reign with him 1,000 years. All right, so again, I don't want to tear apart the 1,000 years yet, and I don't even really want to tear the reigning apart completely. Well, let's see if we can get some of these pieces in place. Well, so what's some of the other scriptures that talk about saints that have been persecuted, that are reigning with Christ? Where else have we seen persecuted saints in the book? And where else have we seen saints reigning with Christ? All right, so back in chapter 6, saints under the altar. How long? How long? Where else do we see saints being persecuted?
Chapter 12, it talks about them not loving their lives to death.
Yep.
That's what they were becoming.
Yep. And then in the chapter following that, remember what the earth beast was doing? Actually, we're seeing some of it coming out in practice, right? He was putting the mark of the beast on those, requiring them to bow down and worship to the sea beast. And if they didn't, then they wouldn't be able to buy or sell. So we had economic persecution, but then he was killing some of them as well. He was killing those that were not receiving that. So again, and I think this is peculiarly insightful that we have almost the exact same phrase from chapter 13 back here again. Who had not worshipped the beast or his image and had not received the mark on their foreheads or on their hands. So these lived and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. So one of the other places that we see that's back in chapter 5 in verse 10 when they're singing that new song to the Lamb, and they talk about that you've redeemed us, you've made us kings and priests to our God, and we shall reign on the earth. So this is one of the other references that we see to this kind of theme as we've been going. So the last passage is Daniel 7, of course. Remember where we saw the war with the beast, and then at that time a judgment was made in favor of the saints, and then the kingdom was turned over to the saints of God. So that's the other place where we see that reference. All right, I want to talk about this a little bit more, but I want to get into just a little bit on Daniel 7 first and just try to tie up this thread. So think about everything that we've been talking about. Compare that back to Daniel 7. What has been fulfilled? What has not been fulfilled at this point in the book of Revelation? And just as general, don't feel like you got to itemize every single bullet. What's some of the big themes of Daniel 7?
The Ancient of Days, victory.
Mm-hmm. So God coming in judgment, setting up his throne, ruling, making a judgment against the beast, and the beast being destroyed. Have we seen that? We have, actually. That's new. That was new the last time we talked about it, but we saw that in chapter 19. Remember at the end of Armageddon, what happened to the sea beast and the false prophet? They were thrown into the lake of fire. And what did Daniel 7 say? The beast. Now, he never mentions the false prophet or the land beast or the earth beast. He only has the detail of the one. He says that his body was given to the fire to be burned. So same reference to him being destroyed in fire. So we've seen the beast destroyed both in Daniel 7 and we've seen it in Revelation. Anything else? How about the persecution, the war against the saints? Have we been through that in Revelation? Yeah, we've seen that part. We've seen the horns, waging war, blasphemous. Anything else? So we've seen basically all of Daniel 7 fulfilled except for this one last piece. The kingdom being turned over to the saints of the Most High to possess. And that's where we are. So, with this point, we've finished Daniel's prophecy of Daniel 7. This is where Daniel stops. He couldn't see past here. So, this is where we are. And Daniel is by far the most farthest reaching of all the Old Testament prophecies. So this not only concludes Daniel, it also concludes all the Old Testament prophecies as well. So that closes the lid shut on that from a prophetic standpoint. And so now we're moving forward into all new territory, that there's not any other Old Testament prophecy looking forward to this. All right. So now let's go back to our text here in chapter 20. So let's get back to the reign and the resurrection. They lived and they reigned with Christ for 1,000 years, but the rest of the dead did not live again until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is he who has part in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power. So, should we interpret this resurrection literally? Got 5 seconds? Yes, no? No. Okay. This is kind of a reoccurring theme, right? We've asked this question about 100 times. It's been no every single time. So, I probably have you guys hardwired to say no now. So, how could this be described as a resurrection? Let's start with that part. What is he talking about? What is being resurrected then? If this is not a literal bodily resurrection, what is he talking about? So we talked about this back in chapter 11, where we actually saw a precedent. Remember the 2 witnesses that were slain and their bodies laid in the street, and then after a certain amount of days, I believe it was 3.5, then they were raised and then called back up into heaven. So we talked about this a little bit back then, but there's Old Testament precedent for using a resurrection to represent figuratively the redemption of a people. So Isaiah 26:19, I think, is one of the clearest verses where Isaiah says, it's interesting because he's talking about himself. He's talking about them coming back to the land. And he says, my body will raise up with you and be in the land. And he clearly ties it to them coming back. But it's obvious he's not talking about himself. It's the fact that he is prophesying it. He's foretelling that they're going to come back to the land. And essentially, his message will be vindicated at that point. Remember, Isaiah told us about this. This is what Isaiah told us about. And so it's going to be like he's resurrected in the fact that he's going to be recalled as part of this. Hosea 13:14 has a similar idea about national Israel being called out of their graves. And actually, this is the verse that Paul quotes at the end of 1 Corinthians 15 about, "O death, where is your sting?" So this is actually what he's quoting from. But I think probably the strongest by far and the most elaborate is Ezekiel 37 and the vision of the valley of dry bones. So just pulling a few excerpts from here, notice Ezekiel's brought out in the spirit of the Lord. So this is clearly a vision. Set down in the midst of a valley, and it's full of bones. And they're all very dry. And God asked Ezekiel, can these bones live? And he says, well, you know. And then God goes on to say, surely I will cause breath to enter into you and to live, speaking to the bones. I will put sinews on you and bring flesh upon you, cover you with skin and put breath into you, and you shall live. Then you shall know that I am the Lord. He says, come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe on these slain that they may live. And then he explains eventually, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. right? And we're not talking about dead people, because they indeed say, our bones are dry, our hope is lost, and we ourselves are cut off. Are they dead? No. They're regarding themselves as good as dead, as there's no hope for them as a nation, as a people. Therefore prophesy and say to them, thus says the Lord God, behold, O my people, I will open your graves and cause you to come up from your graves and bring you into the land of Israel. All right, I'll put my spirit in you, you will live, and I will place you in your own land. So, here is a very detailed picture of a resurrection, and it's clearly being used as a figure. What is it representing? It's not a physical resurrection, it's a spiritual resurrection, if you will. It's a figurative representation of national Israel coming back to their land. It has nothing to do with the physical resurrection. It's completely symbolic. And so we have a good precedent of this kind of idea being pulled from Ezekiel, as well as the other passages that we looked at in Isaiah and Hosea. So, as we say, we saw this also in chapter 11 with the death of the two witnesses, which seems to be that first generation, the apostolic generation, John's generation of the apostles and prophets, them being slaughtered. And, okay, well, this is the end of miracles, this is the end of apostles, this is the end of the prophets. Church is done. That's the end of that. Oh, wait. No, it's not. The church kept going past the apostles and past the prophets. So that seemed to be the point in chapter 11. So we've already got that idea. The apostles were not bodily raised, but the church kept going. So the second death and the second resurrection seems to be pointing to the actual bodily resurrection. This, he's saying, this is the first. The illusion being there's going to be another one going to happen later. And the second death will have no power. So there is this alluded to, unmentioned final resurrection that I believe is talking about the final bodily resurrection of all people. But it's not given in detail here. So both Harkrider and Haley seem to think that it could be a reference to the wicked who died in the Battle of Armageddon, because we're going to see a resurgence of their cause, of their mission. But I'll be honest, that seems to kind of really make this passage a lot more complicated. The passage doesn't go on to talk about that or emphasize that. So that seems to be just putting too much into the passage. I think he's just talking about that everybody else is going to be resurrected after the 1,000 years is over, not going into tremendous detail, just kind of deferring that for a little bit later. All right, and then as he says, the faithful are going to be exempt from the second death, which we understand. We're going to talk about this more later, about this being eternal condemnation in hell. All right, so now let's talk about the rain. What kind of rain is this? Are they on heaven? Are they on earth? Where are these people raining from? Let's just start with that part. Where are they?
With Christ.
They're with Christ. And where's Christ? Heaven. So they're in heaven. Other clue is they're beheaded. I haven't seen too many beheaded people walking around here on earth. So again, another clue, this is in heaven. But where is their reign? Where is their rule being exercised? We looked at this just a second ago. On the earth. Okay, this is a little strange. They're in heaven, but the reign is on earth. All right? So, let's pull up the verse. So, we have these people who are primarily they're in heaven. At least that's where they are at the time of this vision, at the point that he's looking at. But they're pointing to this reign on earth. All right, so here's the passage. Sees the thrones, judgment was committed to them. And I saw the souls of those who have been beheaded for their witness to Jesus for the word of God. And they lived and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. We have judgment, and then I didn't capture the next verse in this slide, where he says they would also serve as priests as well. So we have judges, kings, we have priests, all three of these functions being performed. How? How are these people doing this in heaven but applied to earth.
Their deeds and their success condemns those who failed and rejected Christ.
All right. So, this sets a tremendous example for us. Okay, at least I do have these here. So, in John 15, 18 through 25, let me take a step back. So, generically, not just this, but just in general, anytime the righteous do what is right, then that passes condemnation on the wicked. It does so in two ways. It not only says you could have done better, but in common terms, it breaks the curve, right? I mean, you've all been in college classes or classes where everybody fails, but somebody gets like 105 on the test, and everybody else got a 40. What does that do to the curve? What does the teacher say? You all could have done better. I mean, look, here's somebody got 105, no curve for you. And so really that's kind of what's happening. That's a very crass way of kind of explaining this. But this is what Jesus says effectively in John 15, 18 through 25. He says, I've come, they have no excuse. If I had not have come, but now I have come and now they have no excuse. All right, that's the very principle that Jesus is coming, that his presence, his coming, his keeping of the law takes away all of our excuse to say it can't be done. Well, Jesus did it. And that also tells you, if it takes away our excuse, that means that we've got to be careful that we don't put Jesus in a class so far, so high, removed from us, that we're like, oh yeah, but that's Jesus. No, that's the point, is that could have been us. And we didn't do it. We failed. So going back to Stephen's point from the sermon today, we need to make sure we're taking responsibility for our choices, our actions, and not passing the excuse off. Jesus took away our excuse. Other very similar references in Hebrews 11, 6-7. Noah built the ark, he entered the ark, and he condemned the people of his age. How did he do that? I mean, was he pointing his finger? Was he destroying them? No. He simply just did what God said. That took away the excuse and that they had. And then God, by virtue of that, brought judgment. Romans 2:27, Gentiles will condemn those who, the Gentiles not having the law, but written in their hearts, will condemn the Jews who did have the physical written law. And then in Matthew 12:41-42, in the day of judgment, the people of Nineveh and other places are going to stand up and condemn the people of Jesus' generation who had access to a greater preacher, greater works. These people only had Jonah and they repented. So what's your excuse? All right, so it's the same kind of principle being made over and over again. When people do what's right, it takes away the excuse of people who possibly had it even better but still failed to do what was right. That's just in general. So specifically this case, what happens when you have somebody who is a Christian and the entire world's turned against them, their family and they themselves are threatened with death, economically they're struggling for food and everything else, and they still end up willing to give their life for Christ, watching their loved ones being slaughtered, dying in terrible ways, but they still do what's right anyways. What excuse do I have? I don't have one. What excuse are the people of the world going to have? They're not going to have one either. So their extreme example of victory and faithfulness, it not only takes away the excuse, but it also inspires us as well. I mean, think about Hebrews 11. We talk about the hall of faith, right? We're looking at all these people saying, yeah, that's how it could be done. That's how it was done. That's what I should be doing. And so we're aspiring to that. We're admiring them. We're looking up to them, trying to be like them. So in a very indirect way, they are reigning over us. They're not directly reigning over us, telling us what to do, but by their example, they reign not only over us, but all those of the world. All right. Other thoughts about their reign before we start talking about the millennium specifically? So I think to me one of the most compelling points is it's been 2,000 years. And what are we doing? We're still talking about these people who gave their life for Christ in that way. That is a tremendous reign. There is no other king, there is no other governor, no other nation outside of Christ himself who has a reign that is continued to have such a long-lasting influence. All right, so let's talk a little bit about when is the millennium? And this is one of the questions that I kind of expounded on. So let's talk about the attributes of the millennium. First of all, when did it start? What was the thing that kind of bookended and marked the beginning of it? What were the events that started it?
After the Battle of Armageddon.
All right, Battle of Armageddon. And what happened to the beast?
He was bound and thrown into the abyss.
All right, so the dragon is bound with a chain, and he's put up for 1,000 years, not allowed to go deceive the nations anymore. Earth beasts and sea beasts are destroyed. They're thrown into the lake of fire. All those people that were involved on the wrong side, they died. And but they weren't immediately destroyed, but they died. All right, so that kind of marks the beginning of it. You've read forward a little bit. What marks the end of it? What happens at the end?
Right after Satan's release.
All right, Satan's released, and he goes out to deceive the nations once more. All right, so that was his behavior before. He was stopped from doing that. At the end, he's doing that. All right, let's talk about in between. Just review real quickly. We have the saints, right, sitting on thrones, reigning, their example holding sway over Christians and anybody that is trying to excuse their behavior in the face of persecution and temptation and trial. These people are reigning over them by their example. Anything else happening during this time? All right, let's talk about one other thing real quick. They are priests to God during this time. What is the primary function of a priest? They offer worship, right? That's one of the main functions. But they're offering worship that's not their own. I mean, it includes their own, but they're offering worship on behalf of the people, right? So their primary function is to serve as a mediator, somebody that's kind of in between man and God, drawing these two together. Jesus is the ultimate priest, right? And he can actually lay hands on both and offer a sacrifice on behalf of all of us and stand before God. So a priest is someone who serves as this kind of mediator to draw. God doesn't need to be drawn. It's men that need to be drawn to God, right? So, again, every time somebody looks at their example and is pricked by that, then they are also serving, again, that function of priest. So, we read about before how several of these people have actually died, and during their death, there was either their executioners or other people standing nearby who, like, exclaimed and said that they would rather die with them. So, there is some response, if you will, to their death and to them kind of drawing people towards God. So also serving in that way. So we have the devil being set to the side, being bound. We have this powerful reign, this powerful influence, and then all of a sudden he lets go. So something happens here in the middle, or at the end of this 1,000 years, that kind of turns everything on its head and kind of upsets everything. So, okay. So a couple other thoughts for you to think about as we're kind of trying to pull these clues together. The longest period that's ever prophesied about, okay, there's going to be this event and this event and this event, that I can think of off the, I don't want to say the top of my head, but I've been able to come up with, is the 70 weeks from Daniel chapter 9, all right? And that covers a period of about 600 years. So he's explained this is going to go from the rebuilding of the wall to the time of the people who come next, when they come and they destroy the temple. He's talking about Rome. and destroying the temple of Jerusalem. So Daniel's very concerned about his people. We have this time period about 600 years, and it's symbolically presented to Daniel and to us as 70 weeks. 70 weeks being about 600 years. This is 1,000 years in symbolic form. There is no time period anywhere in Scripture that comes anywhere close to this. This is not used anywhere else. So keep that in the back of your mind. This is kind of a key consideration as well. So now the question is what does the 1,000 years represent? Think about when it started, when it stopped, the things that are happening. Think about this length of time compared to every other length of time told about in the Bible. And now the big question, what does this represent?
Could it be the reign of the saints and Jesus before he hands the kingdoms back over to the Father?
Okay, so what do you mean before he hands it back over to the Father?
At the end, before he hands everything back over.
So you mean like at the end of the world? Yeah, I think this is going to the end of the world, because that's what we're going to see next. The devil released, and then we're going to see the great white throne judgment. And that's part of the reason why I think we do have this dramatic shift. If we've been talking about events that would shortly come to pass, that would start during the time of John and take them for a little while until the destruction, not entire destruction of Rome, but the system of Rome that was persecuting them, right? So the conversion of Constantine, that would have been the end of that. That would have stopped at that point, even though Rome itself would have continued to go and kind of continue to fall apart. So if that's what we've been talking about most of the time, and then now here we are in the last few chapters that we're talking about the end of the world, we're not spending too much time there, but we are spending some time there. We would need something in between to fill the gap. We would need some kind of like expander or some kind of sponge that could just soak up all time to represent the time from the end of Rome to the end of time. And this 1,000 years fits the bill quite nicely. It's a nice round number, no number like it in anywhere in prophecy of any kind. So this easily fills the time from Rome to the end of the world when all of that transpires. So, I think that is what it is, but why 1,000? What's the meaning of the numbers?
We talked about 10 being like full strength of man.
Mm-hmm.
We have that 3 times.
Yep. And what? So we've got 10 times 10 times 10, 10 to the third power. What did 3 mean?
Let's talk about the God and Jesus and Holy Spirit, right?
Well, that is the more traditional view. Everybody associates this with the Trinity. But I don't think that's quite the right answer. Now, there's good basis for that. Holy, 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 right? But the problem is that's not the only place where we see the triple repetition. We see woe, woe, woe. And then back in Jeremiah, we see earth, earth, earth. So it seems to be, I think if you put those things together, what do they have in common? They're all kind of like the extreme emphasis. Where is God in holiness? The max. Earth, earth, earth. Where is this? This is all religion, all of that. Whoa, whoa, whoa. This is extreme. So if 10 represents the full capacity strength of man, times itself 3 times. This is all the strength of all men for all time. This is it. Humanity has run its course. It's exhausted. There's nothing left in mankind at this point. And I think that's the primary point of this. All right, now this was the part that I was wanting to kind of expound on in my slides. All right, so notice what number is not there. 7. Number 7 is a similar number of completion, perfection, but remember, 7 comes from the number of days that God took to create the world. This is the work of God, the length, the limit of God. Remember, God gave the beast the seven heads, right? So God has created this thing, giving it its full capacities, but God has kind of reined it, limited it. God's not in this. This is, I don't want to say it's entirely on us, because any strength we have comes from God ultimately. So, but it is interesting that there's no 7 in this. This is all just 10. All right, so, I think none of the slides that I want are in here. All right, so let's think about this a couple of other different ways. So, similar kind of conclusion, but coming at it from a different way. When does God end civilizations, nations, kingdoms, peoples? Does he arbitrarily do it? All right, so go back to the time of Noah. Completely wicked. So back in Genesis 6. What other commentary do we have from Scripture about when God brings in this final judgment on nations and kingdoms?
When the measure of their wickedness is full. When he talked to Israel about putting the palm line against them and measuring them against his word.
All right. So let's see if we can get some more like detail and clarity. Like, what does that mean? All right, so a few other thoughts. So in Genesis 15, when God's telling Abraham about what he's going to do, he's going to bring him back, his children are going to come out, but not yet. I'm not going to bring them to Canaan and wipe out the people of Canaan yet, because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. I think that's like 15:6 of Genesis. So there's some level of wickedness where God says, that's it. We're done. No more. Okay? What is that? So Jesse brought out another good passage. So another one that comes to mind is 2 Chronicles 36, right? God rose up early. His people sinned more and more, the kings and the priests. He rose up early, sending them prophets, sending warning by his messengers. The people rejected him. They scoffed. They rebelled until what? There was no remedy. So, while you're chewing on that, think about 2 Peter 3:9. God doesn't want anybody to perish, right? He's not willing that any perish, but that all come to repentance into life. And as by virtue of that, what attribute is presented? He's long-suffering. All right? And that is used to explain why the end of the world has not come, because he's being patient. All right? He's being patient so people will repent, because if he comes too soon, then people that would have repented are going to be destroyed. So he's making sure that there's enough time for everybody that would repent for that to be worked out. Okay, so what happens when you get to the point in time when longer time doesn't make a difference? Then what's left? Destruction. There is nothing left. Now, do we know of any precedents of God keeping a country or a nation around even though they had passed that time? Egypt. Why? What did he use them for?
Show his glory all the earth.
All right, good. Any other ones?
Rome. We see Rome being used here as well.
Yeah. Rome is kind of like a New Testament version of Egypt almost. Keeping his people in bondage, saying, who is the Lord? Asserting itself as King of Kings and Lord of Lords.
He used Babylon
Mm-hmm.
to refine his people.
Assyria, right? This is the axe in my hand. So we see God using lots of nations. We see him using people. Think about Jehu. Did Jehu love the Lord? No, not remotely. He thought he was using the Lord, taking advantage of him so that he could get to power, get to authority. But God used Jehu to wipe out the house of Ahab. All right? So we see God using people, using nations as tools of judgment against other nations that are wicked. And in Jeremiah, we even see the picture of like him taking two ceramic jars and bashing them together. He's just using one to destroy the other and the other, right? They're both being completely consumed. So what happens when that's all the nations? There's no other nations left to leave standing. What happens when that's consumed everybody? then the end has to come. There is no more use. So what I'd like to suggest to you is there's kind of three things out of this. One is God uses kingdoms, he uses the world. Think about Romans 8. The whole creation has been subjected to vanity in hope for the revealing of the children of God. That is the point of this creation. It's an engine to produce saints. So what happens when it can no longer produce saints? Go back to chapter 6. What was the answer? Here's your robe, a little bit longer, until the number of their brethren and the fellow servants are fulfilled. It's not that there's a certain amount of wickedness that God says, oh, no, that's it. You've had a billion chances. You can't have any more. You're done. The problem is what happens when an environment gets so wicked that it's not possible for it to produce godly saints. Then it's done. There is no point in keeping it around any longer. It's hopelessly broken. There is no remedy for that machine. So, one of the strongest verses I have, that I don't have it, it's in Ezekiel. I know that's very helpful. But it has some unique language there. He starts off talking to Ezekiel and he says, when a land through persistent rebellion does not listen to me. And he's laying down a general principle. What is he going to do? Then he's going to send his 4 severe judgments on the land. And he ends up saying that how much more am I going to do this to Jerusalem? But he's laying out a general principle of how he treats all nations. And he says that when this nation gets so wicked that even if Noah, Job, or Daniel were there, they wouldn't save anybody else. They couldn't even save their own son or daughter. So when a nation gets so wicked that they can't even bring children into the world and bring them to Christ, when the society is so corrupt that it cannot produce Christians in any form or fashion by any way, not through conversion, not even through bringing children up, then it's done. And his point is how much more will I do this for Jerusalem? In other words, how much more will I go to the extreme of patience, waiting so long, and how much more will I try to send these severe judgments? And we talked about this during the 4 horsemen, that I will bring these judgments on them to try to bring them back. But then that is the point where there's nothing else. So my point is this. Take what we've seen of God over and over again with all these nations and then just take it up one more level. What happens when that characterizes the world? When it has become completely wicked and the last few Christians that are left can't bring any more Christians into the world. The gospel no longer has its power. And I think that's the last hint of the meaning of 10 as well. This is not just talking about that there's no Christians left. Because we're going to see that when the devil comes out and he brings his army, he's going to surround the camp in the beloved city. There are Christians left for him to fight. So it's not that they're all gone. But I think the point is they can't bring any more. They can't produce any more. That somehow the environment has become so hostile that they cannot do that. So, but why is it they cannot do that? Imagine these martyrs, these people giving their life, continuing to do this, but nobody cares. Nobody reacts like they did back during Rome. There's nobody, they're like good riddance. They see these people die brutal deaths, and they sneer and they scoff, and it doesn't prick anybody's heart. So the strength of men being exhausted is not so much that there's no more Christians and they have no more power. There is no more power to convert and to redeem and to bring people out of the world. Again, we're back to the same conclusion. Then it's done. There's nothing left that can be done. So, I think we get to the same conclusion 3 different ways. By the number, by what God's behavior is with nations in the past, and then also with what we've been seeing here as well. So Harkrider and Haley, just for quick background, they call this the martyr spirit. They believe this is what kind of imprisoned the devil. Basically, as long as people had that spirit, then the devil couldn't come out with that kind of influence. Their taking a stand basically limited him. And I think that's part of it, but I think it goes further. It's that in conjunction with people responding to that, being touched by that. When people no longer care about the martyr spirit, when that no longer makes a difference and has an impact on people, when Christians can no longer be created, then that's it. That is the end. All right, that was an awful lot. Again, I think the Ezekiel passage is one of the strongest, and you could just look for Noah, Job, and Daniel in the same verse, and that would take you right to it. Thoughts, questions? So let's briefly talk about lessons. What does this mean to us? This is kind of a heavy thought to chew on. How do we process this? What does this mean to us?
Puts in a greater perspective our purpose here and what we should be trying to accomplish.
Which is?
To bring more saints.
Yeah. Anything else you can think of? I mean, you could take that point and just expound on it, right? We could spend a lot of time talking about that. We could talk about Ephesians 6, taking up the whole armor of God. We could talk about 1 Peter 5, James 4, resist the devil, and he'll flee from you. Submit yourselves under the hand of God. Humble yourselves. All the passages that talk about us basically taking up the fight. Putting on our armor, having that kind of perspective. But at the end of the day, I think Matthew 28, 18 through 20, all authority has been given to me on heaven and earth. This is going to make a lot more sense to us and have a lot more meaning, deeper meaning to us now, having seen this side of Revelation. When Jesus says, all authority has been given to me in heaven and earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them, teaching them to do all the things that I've commanded you. So this verse puts a weight on us. So on one hand, I want to make sure that we all feel that weight appropriately, right? We have a mission, we have a charter, and it makes a difference. This number, what it looks like in practice and in reality, is in some measure dependent on us. If we roll over and if we get all busy with all the things of this world and we're not proclaiming the gospel, which is the power of God to save, pushing that out, if we're not doing that, then that date comes in. People aren't going to be saved, and things are going to go from bad to worse much quicker. So I think it's important for us to see the part that we play. Now, can we feel too much weight? Yes. I want to make sure that this doesn't become like too big of a burden for us to bear either. Even though it's not exactly appropriate, I like the language that the angel says to Daniel at the end, go your way. Your part in this applies to things that are out beyond you, your rest, and then you will wake up when it's time. But go your way for now. So what do we do? Again, we follow Matthew 28, 18 through 20. We keep doing the same things that we already know to be doing. Hopefully this just encourages us that much more to be busy about those things. But at the end of the day, who's the one who leads the army? Who's the one who wins the war? Is it us? No, it's Jesus. So I think also the wording of Solomon from Ecclesiastes 9, do not be overly righteous. Don't put too much on yourself. Don't assume burdens that are not your own. It's a very general verse that has lots of different applications, but I think this is one of them. Don't take too much on yourself. Realize our part. The war has already been won, and our job is we're trying to get as many casualties off the field and try to save people that would otherwise be lost. And if we do that, we'll have a big and very valuable impact on the world. So, yeah, I think that's enough for me to say on that. What other questions or thoughts does everybody have?
I guess my one question is about some of the language about not knowing when the end is coming, because that seems to put some clear indicators, but at least when it's not coming, because we see still people are still being converted, and so if people are still being converted, that means that the end cannot come. But we don't know when the end is coming, right? So do you think there's just an indicator of we can have confidence that the end is not coming now because people are still being converted? And one day we'll see someone, some generation will see a transition where there is no progress being made before the end comes. Does that question make sense?
Yeah, it does. I'll offer some thoughts that may or may not address the question.
Okay.
So, where is it in Ecclesiastes where it says something about that the former days being better than these days, and you do not inquire wisely about this, right? There's a sense in which every generation thinks that things have gotten worse in their generation. And it's just not really good to dwell on that for a couple of reasons. A lot of what we see as getting worse is not really us getting worse. It's us becoming more aware of what's going on. But then sometimes things really are getting worse. But what are you going to do about it? I mean, that's kind of back to again, putting too much of a burden on us. We've got a job to do. Stick to the mission. Stick to the plan. Don't get thrown off on the challenge that's in front of us. The total challenge falls on God. Our job is just to stick to our part of the plan. So, but it comes to mind because the people who find themselves at that end, what will they do with that, right? I mean, they very well might be kind of like us saying, I don't see how it can keep going on, right? At some point, somebody's going to say that and they're going to be right. It's not going to be able to keep going on. But the other piece of it is what are you going to do about it? You can't see everything. And so I think that's the other factor of difficulty of even the people who are at the end may not realize because they can't see the whole world. They don't realize what, we've talked about this over and over again. Why is the end of the world language appropriate for Edom, for Moab and Ammon? Because for those people, it was the end of their world. They couldn't see past that. So there is an appropriateness to this. Same point can be said here is it will feel like the end of the world is upon those people, but they're not going to know whether that actually applies to them or the whole world until it really is the end of the world. So anyway, I don't know if any of those thoughts are helpful, but even still, some of those people, and they might feel like it, but how many times have people felt like that before and been wrong? So at the end of the day, no, we don't know. So we know something of the conditions, right? But we don't know the specifics. And even knowing the conditions, we're really bad at figuring out do they apply. So I think it's still safe to say we don't know.
And I would say that knowing the conditions of what we were just talking about is not for the purpose of us trying to figure out when it's going to come, but to motivate us to do our part, our duty in God's kingdom.
Yep. And again, I think one of the things that this does take off of you is you don't really need to know. I mean, what does this say? Does this say, well, you can take it easy for a little bit and then we're going to get serious about it? No, it says you want to be serious the whole time, right? So we could apply a lot of the lessons from Matthew 24 about the unfaithful or the faithful steward, right? One of them, it's who knows when he'll be back. And he took advantage of it. And the other one was faithful, and he kept up his job. And then when the master of the house appeared at an hour that he didn't expect, he was ready. So, I mean, again, all those lessons still apply. Parable of talents, minas, etc. Other thoughts? Also, just in closing, I think this makes the wording of Daniel 7 about the kingdom being turned over to the saints, it makes it a whole lot more richer too. Again, the kingdom really is in our hands. What are we going to do with it? Again, does that leave God out of it? No. Ephesians 6, take up the whole armor of God. It is God who gives us it's His word that has the power to save. But it's our choice whether we pick those up and use it, whether we're diligent with it. Just don't kill yourself in the next 30 days trying to save the world. Don't put too much on yourself. So there is a balance here. Remember who's in charge of the war and who's already won it. Other thoughts or questions? All right. So let's talk about the millennial views. Remember, there's three views: premillennialism, postmillennialism, and amillennialism. Which one of these do you think best fits the context? All right, let's take a step back. Do what? Amillennialism. All right, let's kind of walk through these just kind of one by one real quickly. Remember, premillennialism is called pre because they believe Jesus is going to show up before the 1,000-year reign. All right? And then there's going to be the millennialism, or millennium, and there's two variations of this. One of these, as I mentioned to you earlier, believe that the Jews are going to be restored as a special nation again. And here's a very busy chart that depicts this. But they see, if you notice at the very beginning, the church age. Notice it's in parentheses. And that's significant because they believe that God never prophesied it, never foretold it, that He intended when Jesus first came for the Jews to accept Him and put Him on the throne. And because they rejected Him and crucified Him, God said, oh, I need a plan B. And so He invented the church as His plan B. There's no prophecies about it. It's completely unforetold, completely unexpected. And it's a reaction to the Jews rejecting Jesus as their king. So He kind of filled this in. That's the reason it's in parentheses. It's because it's like God kind of like, oh, by the way, and just kind of put this in the timeline. But it was never supposed to be part of it. But the prophetic clock, all of the Old Testaments, which they see, Ezekiel and Isaiah, they foresee those things applying to the end of the world, just like Revelation. They're putting all that stuff out into the future. None of that has come to pass. They believe that that clock was stopped, and then there's going to be this period of trouble. Jews come back, the Antichrist will appear, and then Jesus is going to come. There'll be a literal battle of Armageddon. All the things that we've said are figurative, they believe are literal. All that blood, all the horses, all the everything. That's all going to be there in Israel and the land of Palestine. And then Jesus is going to reign on the throne for 1,000 years with all of His saints. And then when it's over, the millennium completely fails. Despite all of this prosperity, all of this golden age, when the devil's let loose, where is everybody's loyalty? They go headlong for the devil. And that's one of the points that Haley really stresses is this is kind of like ridiculous that they've had all of this and then it's a complete failure because as soon as the devil appears, everybody jumps ship. So then there's one last preparation for a battle and then the end of the world. So the other variation of this is very similar, but they kind of leave out the whole Jewish, like they can be converted, but there's not going to be a restoration of the temple necessarily. Well, excuse me, that's postponed into the millennium. So it's not a separate little dispensation there. All right. Oh, these are all messed up. So post-millennial is the idea that Jesus is going to come after the 1,000 years, which I believe is correct, but they believe it's a literal 1,000 years, and they believe that basically this is the Pollyanna view of the world. Things are just going to keep getting better and better and better, and we're just going to turn earth into heaven. Everybody's going to be Christians, and it's going to be wonderful, and we're just going to roll right in from this perfect world, from this utopia, straight into heaven. And Jesus is going to kind of come as a demarcation, but that's it. And so some of them believe it's a literal 1,000, some of them think it's figurative, but that's the general view, is that things are just going to get better and better and better. The amillennial is the one that I think is correct. We have the present age, the church age, that says that the millennium started basically after the destruction of Rome and that persecuting empire. After Christ's kingdom was established as the kingdom, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, that the millennium began at that point. The devil lost access to the sea beast, the false prophet. He lost that scale, that control. That ushered in an era of relative peace compared to what the devil was doing. And so that will continue until some point in time, which we've already discussed what that is, and then he is let loose, and there's one last confrontation, and then the end of the world. And I think that's the best fit with the context. So why? There's a lot of problems with the premillennial. They take it very literal. We've touched on these as we've been going through the class. They take it very literally. They also are very confused, putting everything way off in the future, even like everything in the future. Not just the last little bit, but everything in the future, which makes John's statement that these events must shortly take place make no sense. And they do switch back and forth. They do actually, even though they think it's literal, whenever they get stuck, they're like, oh, that part's figurative. So there's an extreme and very convenient and disconcerting inconsistency to that. They also put the tribulation, the kingdom way off into the future, even though John says that he's their brother in both of those things at the time of writing. So one of the other kind of big problems is they misunderstand the place of God's relationship with the Jews, and they try to maintain that status of special people and God still working through them, whereas Zechariah 11 is very clear that their special place is broken, they're destroyed. God's going to ensure they continue to exist to the end of time as a witness to his working among mankind, but they will never have a special status. For all practical purposes, they are Gentiles at this point in time. So even though they have a tremendous legacy, and that's an oversimplification, obviously, but as far as special people status and a special work, beyond their protection, they are as Gentiles. So the church is the kingdom that God works through now. Other big problem with premillennialism is key tenets that they need to find in this section of chapter 20 aren't there. A second coming of Jesus, a bodily resurrection, Jesus reigning on earth in Jerusalem, on a literal throne of David, and it being the Jerusalem of Palestine, the Jews being converted, and none of those things are mentioned here. So the other huge big problems is that means that all of the prophets, even Jesus himself, got time wrong. They completely missed that and misunderstood it. All right, and it makes God less powerful. And the fact that he could not actually establish his kingdom despite his intentions. All right, post-millennial has very similar problems in taking things literally, and it completely ignores the fact that things are actually going to get worse, not better. And a lot of passages talk about things getting worse over time, not better, and so it misses that. So I think the amillennial best fits not only the symbolic, but also the nature of how things are going to be, that things are going to get worse. All right, this was the slide that I had for actually capturing some of the points that we went. And I actually deleted this one because I spread it across like 6 slides in the other revision. So I'm just going to put that up there for the video. All right. Any questions about this section before we get into the last rebellion? All right. So my plan is to have one more class, and we're going to speed run it. This is the end of all of the difficult passages. And we've got kind of the only thing left that's kind of a little tricky is Gog and Magog. So we'll do a little bit of digging on that, and then everything else should be material that we've seen many times. And so we're going to go through that last class and those last 2 chapters pretty quickly. So come prepared for the end of it. And then I may start a little bit earlier. I may start at 3 the next time. But next time will be 2 weeks from now. So because we'll be gone next Sunday. So we won't have class next Sunday, but the Sunday after that. And if that ends up being a problem for somebody, just talk to me. I can push it off for more too. So, so that's my plan. So just plan for one more big class, and we'll be done one way or the other after that. Thank you all very much. I know that y'all have lots going on, so I appreciate all the extra time and commitment. I hope it has been worth your time. And so, but for my part, thank you for attending and helping me to be able to present.
Yeah. I think that's the week from this coming Sunday.
Oh,